All right, welcome to part 2 of our Principles of Ecology notes. Remember last time, just a quick reminder, we learned about the levels of organization in ecology: an organism, an individual living thing, population, same species, community, different species, ecosystem, living things and non-living things. We're going to learn more about that here in a minute in our new notes. And then, of course, a biome is a major regional or global community that has similarities. Okay, and we talked about some different ways the ecologist can research, including observation, experimentation, and modeling. So just really briefly on that. And then we'll pick up on our notes in part 2. The first thing I want to talk about is an ecosystem. Remember, an ecosystem, looking back at our notes, this is all the living components and non-living components in a given area. Up until this point, lower levels, we're just talking about those living organisms, right? But here we start adding in the non-living components, okay? And we need to learn some terms. A biotic factor, when we're looking at an ecosystem, a biotic, bio of course means life. It's a prefix that means life. Biotic includes the living things. So this would be animals, plants, bacteria, amoeba, mosses, anything like that. Okay, anything that has life, that requires energy to continue its life, anything that can reproduce its same species or same kind, those are biotic factors. Okay, these are the things that we focus on by and large most of the time, right? We want to talk about the trees. We want to talk about the grasses that the animals eat. We want to talk about the animals. We want to talk about the bacteria that can make certain things sick. All right, we want to talk about these things. The biotic factor seems to be normally the easy thing to understand. Then you have abiotic factors. Anytime you add an A as a prefix, it means without, okay, or different or something like that. So abiotic is without life, bio meaning life. So these are the non-living things that we find in an ecosystem, and these things are important. Okay, these things, if some of them are taken away, there would be no life, such as water or moisture or precipitation, or however you want to talk about it. If we removed all water from an environment, just think about what would happen to us. Same thing's going to happen to all living things. Water is necessary for life here on Earth. But water itself, or moisture, however you want to think about it, because some places have snow and ice, but it's abiotic. Okay, some people say, well, water's alive. No, water's not alive. Now, it does sustain life, and there's a lot of living things in it, even microbial things, small things, but it is not alive. Think about your temperature, your climate. Okay, think about the heat or the cold of an ecosystem. We look at this picture here of a desert climate. It's not quite a desolate desert. There's plenty of greenery here, but all of these plants survive best in hot temperatures. Okay. And animals that live here normally are well adjusted to that hot temperature. Temperature, however, is not living. It's without life. It's abiotic. Your wind, that falls in with climate a little bit. The sunlight, same thing. Of course, we have more and more sunlight. Typically, it results in a higher temperature. And also another thing is the soil, the type of soil, the depth of the soil in some places. All of the things that go with the soil is an abiotic factor, okay, because it does affect it affects life in that ecosystem. I was watching a show this past weekend where the soil was polluted from coal mining hundreds of years ago. Well, not hundreds, but about 100 years ago. It was in Kentucky, I believe it was. And the soil was so bad because of the coal that had been taken out and the pollutants that had been put into it. The soil couldn't grow any food. These people that lived there, they had tried to grow a vegetable garden, no luck. The water was also polluted as well. That certainly affected the ecosystem of that living of that place these people lived. Okay, so bad soil, even though it was an abiotic factor, certainly affected all the biotic factors, causing some of them not be around anymore. No plant life. Think about it logically. If you don't have any plant life, there's probably not going to be any animals, because animals that eat plants aren't going to have anything to eat, and animals that eat animals aren't going to be able to pick those animals off. So abiotic factors are hugely important. Ecosystems are very closely related. Sometimes we don't even realize how fragile they are until one thing changes. Changing one factor in an ecosystem can affect many other factors. When we look at the diversity or the assortment or variety, or however you want to look at it, of the living things in the ecosystem, we have this term called biodiversity. Okay, I like to think of it as an area can be very biodiverse, or it can be less biodiverse. More biodiverse meaning it's got lots and lots and lots of living things, and they're very different from each other. There's lots of plants life. There's lots of animal life. Biodiversity talks about the living things in an ecosystem. And the amount of biodiversity that an ecosystem has depends on many factors. A lot of times it can depend on, like we were talking about that vegetation, the abiotic factors. If it's ideal for living, then you're probably going to have more diversity. Think about the tropical rainforest. And we're going to watch a video in the coming days all about jungles. You're going to see it's very biodiverse. It has a large biodiversity, meaning that there is such a huge variety or assortment of living things in that ecosystem. Now flip it on its head to like the polar ice caps, right? The polar ice caps is going to have very little diversity. There's not a lot of things living there. There is little to none of vegetation. And because there's no plants, very few of them, you won't have animals. There'll only be a few that live there. And most of those are carnivores that are able to eat off marine ecosystems that are right around the polar ice caps. Okay, so you would say the polar ice caps are less diverse or have little biodiversity, right? Does that make sense? Hopefully. The last thing I want us to talk about, we'll probably get done a little early, is something called a keystone species. So we just hit on, looking back, changing one factor in an ecosystem can affect many other factors. Now, sometimes it doesn't affect very many at all. An animal may become extinct and nobody really notices. The keystone species is the opposite of that. It's a species, animal, plant, whatever, that has an unusually large effect on its ecosystem. So a lot of times there's not just a list of keystone species. You have to look at the way that the keystone species affects everything else in that certain ecosystem. And you may have, let's say, an animal in one ecosystem that is a keystone species because it has such a huge effect, and then you put it into a different ecosystem, and it's just a run-of-the-mill, organism. Nothing, is super overwhelming. So keystone species, there's not like a certain list. It depends on how it affects the ecosystem, right? And one way we see is that a keystone species is if it's removed. If there's a loss of this species, it causes a huge ripple effect felt across the entire ecosystem. We're going to look at several and some different assignments this week. You're going to get a chance to look at what are some keystone species and how do they really cause an effect, especially with their loss or if they're reintroduced to a certain ecosystem. It has a huge ripple effect. It can affect the animals that maybe they prey on, or the trees that may come back, or the vegetation that may grow in. And we'll even see that sometimes reintroducing an animal to an ecosystem can affect the way that water moves and changes. It's pretty interesting. You will see it's not just one thing that's affected by it. It's many, many, many things. And I like the visual effect of a ripple effect. You drop a water droplet in, a bowl of water or whatever, it'll hit right away and then bloop, 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 ripple on out, right? Almost like causing waves felt across the entire ecosystem. A great example of a keystone species in most any ecosystem that's in is a beaver. And it probably wouldn't be the first thing that you would think about if you had to name a keystone species. If you're like me, you probably think about some big predator that, if it's gone, everything starts to increase its population, right? There's more of whatever animals it was eating. But think about a beaver for a minute. A beaver, once it builds a dam inside a wetland, it might clog up a river. And because that river gets backed up, we start seeing a pond forming, or a waterway gets constricted in some form or fashion. But what's normally going to happen is the fish, instead of traveling downstream, they'll increase their population, right? Anything that eats fish, like waterfowl, let's say, for example, birds swooping in to eat these fish, they'll start targeting that pond. That's a hot spot now. Instead of having to find another place that fish are swimming along, they've got them all in this one controlled area. With a dam, this water starts backing up, and you might see certain vegetation and plants growing around this area that maybe it wasn't before because it wasn't acquiring water, it wasn't getting water. And that can bring in birds. With all of these different things, you might get some more predators. Think about a bear that eats these fish. Now suddenly that bear is drawn to that area where once it flew through. The beaver, unknowingly, it was just building a dam. It was just building a home for it to live. But when it did that, it caused all this differences in water and abiotic factor, which then caused a whole lot of biotic factors, the plants and animals, to change. So a beaver would be a keystone species. And think about if we removed the beaver at that point from this area, from this ecosystem. Water begins to flow again. This area doesn't have all the water in it. The fish population, of course, goes down because fish need water to live in. Those trees are not getting water maybe back here in the background anymore, so birds aren't flying in there. Of course, we're not seeing any predators that eat fish coming around anymore because those fish are downstream by then. So you can kind of see a keystone species is one that if it's introduced, if it's brought in, or if it comes in, or even if it's removed, it greatly changes the ecosystem, right? The beaver, in this case, is the one that triggers everything. It starts the ripple effect, okay? You have some assignments. One of them that's near and dear to my heart is the gray wolf. And you'll read about that. The gray wolf was completely killed out of Yellowstone National Park back in the 1930s. And after the gray wolf was gone, things changed drastically. There was a program that is initiated in 1995. Spoiler alert, I'm giving away some of the things later. 95 to reintroduce the gray wolf. And just in a very short amount of time, within just a couple years, the entire ecosystem of Yellowstone National Park, which is enormous, began to change. Certain animals started acting differently because now they had a predator after them. The beaver was actually came back in because of some of those things. Vegetation started coming back in, and it completely changed the landscape. Keystone species do that. They cause great change. That brings us to the end of part 2 of your notes. Make sure you're taking your student notes. Those might come in handy one day, and you have a quiz following this to go ahead and take using your student notes.